Hello everyone, this is Karn Architect, and for today's commander, we're going to be looking at Karn Legacy Reforged, a 5-mana colorless legendary artifact creature golem that says its power and toughness are equal to the greatest mana value amongst artifacts you control, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you add 1 colorless mana for each artifact you control, and this mana cannot be spent to cast non-artifact spells. Until the end of your turn, you do not lose mana as steps and phases end. So our general strategy with this commander, get it out as early as possible, and it's going to generate an insane amount of value for us because everything we play is an artifact. So we're going to generate a bunch of colorless mana during our upkeep, which is going to allow us to play all of our spells. So at mana value 0, we're going to be looking at Everflowing Chalice, multi-kicker 2, and then for each time it was kicked, you add a charge counter to it, and then you add 1 colorless mana for each charge counter on Everflowing Chalice. So if we have extra mana, we could just dump it into this, and then it becomes a mana rock for us that's going to generate us a ton of colorless mana. Then we have Soul Talisman. For 1 colorless, we can suspend it for 3. So after 3 turns, it's going to turn into basically Soul Ring. It's going to tap and add 2 colorless mana. Speaking of mana value 1, we have Soul Ring and Stone of Erek. That basically says if a creature an opponent controls would die, you exile it instead. And then you can tap 2 mana and tap this to sacrifice it and exile target player's graveyard and draw a card. So the cool thing about it is we can just let it sit on the board, especially against those decks that are trying to reanimate. So if we could just turn this out on turn 1, it's going to shut down their strategy of reanimating cards from their graveyard. Then at mana value 2, we're going to be looking at Patchwork Automaton. It has War 2, and then whenever you cast an artifact spell, you put a 1/1 counter on it. Then we're going to talk about Steel Overseer, that we can tap it to put a 1/1 counter on each artifact creature you control. Then we're going to talk about Zenith Chronicler. Sorry. Whenever a player casts their first multi-spell colored each turn, each other player draws a card. So it's going to allow us to draw cards. At mana value 3, we're going to be looking at Liberator Urza's Battlethopter. It has flash and flying, and it allows us to cast our colorless spells and artifacts as though if they had flash. And then whenever you cast a spell, if the amount of mana spent to cast that spell is greater than its power, you put a 1/1 counter on it. And then lastly, we're going to talk about Nettlecyst, Living Weapon. When this equipment enters the battlefield, you create a 0/0 black Phyrexian Germ creature token, then attach this to it, Equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact or enchantment you control, and for 2 mana, you can equip it to another creature. The mana value 4, we have cards like Hedron Archive to allow us to ramp. The familiar makes our artifacts cost 1 less to cast. Lowe's Toad Golem makes non-artifact spells cost 1 more to cast for our opponents. For Thrandanimo as a mana rock. Traktos as a solid 7/7 with trample, that whenever we cast a historic spell, an artifact, we get to untap it, since when the ETB's tapped, it doesn't untap during your untap step. So by playing artifacts will allow us to untap this, and we have a big 7/7 trampler for 4. And then at mana value 5, we have Forsaken Monument. Colorless creatures you control get +2/+2. Then whenever you tap a permanent for colorless mana, you add an additional colorless. And whenever you cast a colorless spell, you gain 2 life. Then we have Mind's Eye. Whenever an opponent draws a card, you may pay 1. If you do, you get to draw a card yourself. At mana value 6, we're going to talk about a new card called Shamil the Inner Sun. Spells you control cannot be countered, which is amazing. And at the beginning of your end step, you discover 5. So you're going to exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card with a non-land card with mana value 5 or less. You cast it without paying its mana cost, or put it into your hand, and you can put the rest onto the bottom in a random order. Then we're going to talk about the Immortal Sun. Players cannot activate Planeswalker's loyalty abilities. At the beginning of your draw step, you draw an additional card. Spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and it also buffs all your creatures by +1/+1. Then we're going to talk about Ugin the Ineffable. Colorless spells you cast cost 2 less to cast. Then for its plus ability, you exile the top card of your library face down and look at it, and you create a 2/2 color Spears creature token, and when that token leaves the battlefield, you put the exile card into your hand. And then lastly, we're going to talk about Wurmcoil Engine that has Death Touch and Lifelink, and then when it dies, you create a 3/3 colorless Worm Artifact creature token with Death Touch and a 3/3 colorless Worm Artifact creature token with Lifelink. So it basically replaces itself by splitting into 2 creatures with the same 2 abilities of Death Touch and Lifelink. At mana value 7, we have All Is Dust as our mass removal. So each player sacrifices all color permanents he or she controls, and since we're colorless, it's not going to affect us. We play cards like Meteor Golem that when the ETBs, you destroy target non-land permanent and opponent controls. And then we play the new Gnome, threefold Thunderhulk, that when it ETBs, it enters with 3/1/1 counters on it. And then whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you create a number of 1/1 gnomes equal to its power. And then you can pay 2 to sacrifice another artifact to put a 1/1 counter on threefold Thunderhulk. At mana value 8, we have Cityscape Leveler. It's an 8/8 with Trample, that whenever you cast a spell and then whatever attacks, you destroy up to 1 target non-land permanent and its controller creates a tap Power Stone, and then we can unearth it for 8. At mana value 9, we have Portal to Phyrexia. When it ETBs, each opponent sacrifices 3 creatures. At the beginning of your upkeep, you put target creature card from your graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. It is a Phyrexian in addition to its other types. Mana value 10, we have Ancient Stone Idol. It has Flash, and it costs 1 less to cast for each attacking creature. So if our opponent does swing out with several creatures, it will become 1 less to cast for each creature. It has Trample, and then when it dies, it creates a 6/12 colorless Construct Artifact creature token with Trample. Mana value 11, we have Darksteel Colossus with Trample and Indestructible, and then if it will be put into the graveyard from anywhere, reveal it and shuffle it into its owner's library instead. Then we have Metal War Colossus. This spell costs X less to cast, where X is the total mana value of non-creature artifacts you control, and you can sacrifice 2 artifacts, return it from your graveyard to your hand. And then lastly, at mana value 12, this is our late game winner. If we can get this out early, even better. Trample and Infect and Indestructible, and if Lifesteal Colossus will be put into the graveyard from anywhere, reveal it and shuffle into its owner's library instead. So as far as Infects works, if your opponent has 10 Infect counters, they automatically lose the game. So if we can somehow swing through with this without it being blocked, they're going to take Infect damage and they're going to lose the game. As far as lands go, they're basically all utility lands. I don't really have to go over this. If you want to know what the lands do, you can just look at the Moxfield link, hover over it. But we are playing all the Urza lands because they work very well together and they're going to generate us a ton of colorless mana. And this deck is not going to be a part of my budget commander list because this deck is coming around $380. But if you still like this style of content, please hit that subscribe button and have a good day.